From a historical perspective, this idea of hazing has been around since about 1400. German universities had a process that they called penalism. And so it was the new students came in, they were viewed as insubordinate, they weren't as good as the upper class students, so they had to go through a process where they carried a pen case with them at all times. And there was a lot of physical violence that was associated with this idea of penalism. In Great Britain, they had a similar process developed in the mid-1700s that they called fagging. It was personal menial servitude. United States, we see hazing around 1850, and it's a combination of the two. So you saw some of the physical aspects of it, you saw some of the servitude aspects of it as well. And so that was a part of something that developed, but it was always geared toward the newest people coming into higher education. In Germany, in Great Britain, even the United States, it was a university-sanctioned activity. What we started to see early on, there were a lot of different deaths and violent incidents. I think about Indiana University. They chronicle in there's a 4-volume history of the of Indiana University, and they talk about hazing there where they literally scalped freshmen, meaning they took a knife and cut the hair off their head. So it was very violent, very brutal, physical. So early 1900s, colleges and universities said, this hazing is a bad thing, we got to stop it. And so once they did that, fraternities and sororities are starting to develop. The first, 1776, the College of William and Mary, Phi Beta Kappa, which today we know as an elite honor society. But that was the first organization. And then after that, you get into what we started to call the social fraternities. First at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1812, Kappa Alpha Society, which is different from the modern day Kappa Alpha Order. And it was founded actually by 4 men who were members of Phi Beta Kappa. So these groups are starting to develop 1800s, going into the 1900s, colleges and universities get rid of hazing. Then we see it in fraternities and sororities, and it really just takes off early 1900s. By 1920, you have these rules out by colleges and universities, there'll be no more hazing of freshmen. And that's when we see the rise. Even though you saw some latent hazing going back until the 1960s and 70s, where you saw people that had beanies and they were sort of still recognized as freshmen, but you didn't have the physical aspects of hazing that we had up until then. So we go through a period of history whereas now this culture of hazing sort of now becomes entrenched in the fraternity and sorority experience. And one of the seminal events, I think, is 1978, the movie Animal House comes out. It's a very important movie because it's really the first popular culture attempt to define the fraternal experience. And so in this movie, as you hear today, when anything bad happens, people talk about Animal House. That's the kind of the image that it presented. It was wild, it was reckless, and people thought that that was the fraternal experience. So that's 1978. In the mid-1980s, the insurance commissioners in Colorado did a study. And they said, what are the riskiest ventures? And it makes sense, most of the things on the list, bars and liquor stores and child care centers. In the 1980s, you remember asbestos was big. And right below asbestos was fraternities and sororities. That was in the 80s, and they started to realize, and you think about the 80s, that's when we started to have reality TV shows, the Judge shows, Judge Judy, all of those shows. So we moved into this litigious society, and all of those things kept happening at that point in time. So the culture hasn't changed, but now we have more and more of these hazing cases that are very prominent. We start to see deaths more prominent in late 1980s in Georgia. I was a student at the University of Georgia at Morehouse College in Atlanta. There was a death of a young man who was pledging my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. And I always tell people as a college student, when that happened, it's in Atlanta, which is 70 miles away from Athens. On our campus, we wouldn't even wear our letters. We were so ashamed that that had happened, and our new student newspaper, the Red and Black, was asking us questions, what happened in Atlanta? We were like, we don't know what happened over there. It was just that kind of stain. And so for some groups, particularly historically black fraternities and sororities, the very next year they said, we're gonna get rid of this hazing by ending pledging. Well, that didn't work because people just started to carry out in some kind of underground format. So now we're going into the 90s. Colleges and universities are trying to figure out, what do we do with this? I started my career in 1992 at Emory University. I was coordinator of Greek life. I started the semester after they had their bid day when the new members were selected. They had 2 rapes on fraternity rolls, so it was a lot of pandemonium going on. And this was an era when colleges and universities started to create what they call relationship statements, that if you're going to be a chapter on our campus, here are the set of things that you agree to do. And that was one of the first waves to try to address hazing, but a lot of that didn't work. At the same time, we were in a system where we were trying to get rid of hazing by ending pledging. I mentioned the historically black groups in 1989. That wasn't the first attempt. Lambda Chi Alpha in 1974 went to an associate member program, meaning you weren't a pledge, you were an associate member. We still have hazing cases and hazing deaths in Lambda Chi Alpha. 1989, ZBT and TEAC both got rid of pledging. ZBT says they don't have pledging, but they still have hazing cases. TEAC abandoned it, and they went back to pledging. That was from 1989, at the same time that the historically black groups did the same thing. So we're dealing with all this in the 90s. This fall, to me, is very similar to the fall of 1997, which is important for this community. Because in 1997, we had the hazing death at LSU. They had the pledges who were standing in garbage cans because they made them drink so much. When they puke, they could just puke right in the garbage can. So you had the death here, then you had the death at MIT. MIT was sued. They paid out $6 million. So that was really big in the news. I worked at Old Dominion at the time, and there was just a lot of confusion about what's happening with our communities. And so we're seeing hazing cases very consistently. You start to also see changes in laws during this time, early 2000s. One of them was the state of Florida. There was a fraternity that had their pledges swim in a lake at the University of Miami that was off limits because the lake has alligators and crocodiles in it. So they have a pledge, a drunk pledge, swimming in the lake with alligators and crocodiles. He doesn't get eaten, he drowns. And so when they changed this early 90s, it's called Chad Meredith Act. So that now made hazing in Florida not a misdemeanor, but a 3rd-degree felony. Right after that, you had a fraternity at Florida A&M, hazing case. 5 men were on trial, 2 were sentenced to 2 years in jail. So that started to change the game a little bit. But as I told a lot of people, 6 months after they are sentenced to go to jail, even in the state of Florida, you had hazing cases and people having hazing incidents. So it raised a profile, and we still had a lot of cases. In more recent years, in the last 5 years, up until this fall, the highest profile hazing case also happened in Florida at Florida A&M, where we had the death of the drum major Robert Champion. And that was strange because it made all the news shows because people were just saying, is there hazing in bands? We couldn't understand what was going on with bands. He was a drum major. He didn't feel like he was really respected by all the different areas, and so they had this process where they're on a bus and he's being beaten by members of the drum section, and the coroner talked about how his body he had all this massive internal bleeding based on the beating that he got on that bus. So that took hazing to a whole nother level of discussion in our country because it was a ban. And as I tell people in the fraternity and sorority community, it got more attention because people almost expect fraternities and sororities to haze and kill people now. And that's unfortunate, but people aren't as shocked. That was really until this fall, well, really this year. You had the case at Penn State in February, Piazza at Penn State, which got a lot of press and continues to get a lot of press. And then we've had 3 hazing deaths this fall. Of course, here at Florida State, at Texas State. And then there's just last week, there is an unrecognized fraternity at SUNY Brockport that has a death. So technically, we've had 5 hazing deaths this calendar year, which I'll have to go back and check, but this is one of the highest probably ever. And so we're at this point where people are trying to figure out, what do we need to do? There have been lots of stories written in the news with these kinds of headlines I want to share with you because these are the questions that people are asking right now. Can deeply ingrained frat culture be reformed after hazing deaths? This was a PBS story. Washington Post, colleges need to take on Greek life before more people die. Time magazine, why colleges should get rid of fraternities for good. The Philadelphia paper, close down all fraternities. Atlanta Journal-Constitution, are fraternities committed to raising men or raising hell? And then a final one, when are frats going to stop killing their pledges? And then Frank Bruni at the New York Times wrote, their pledges die, so should fraternities. So there's been much more pushback this year about what's going on with fraternities and sororities. So here are some things I've been thinking about, and then I'll share with you. Even in my own fraternity, I've tried to push back with some of the things that have been going on. In 1998, I was a part of a group that created an undergraduate institute for college men in the fraternity. And my chapter at the University of Georgia has a listserv, and one of the undergraduates a couple years ago wanted to take a stand to support a fraternity that was hazing. And he didn't know that I know there was video evidence of the hazing. And I was like, you guys don't need to do this, and you need to, think about putting your name on something that is documented being wrong. And another younger member of the fraternity challenged me to say, look, everybody's equal here. It doesn't matter if you're an undergraduate member or a college president. Now, I'm not just a regular college president in my fraternity. I've been Southern Region Assistant Vice President, which meant I was on the board of directors as an undergraduate. And so I've had lots of leadership roles in it. And so I wrote an article for our fraternity magazine called The Unwinnable War. And one of the things that I wrote in the article was this: every day, despite lots of education, real life examples, people decide to haze because that is what they want to do. And what they want trumps what is best for the organization and even themselves. And so we're in this culture that people just want to do what they want to do when it comes to hazing. The North American Interfraternity Conference, which represents about 70 or so men's fraternities, most predominantly white, but there are some African American groups and Latino groups that are part of it, had 3 task forces to deal with the big issues: sexual assault, alcohol, and hazing. And so I chaired this national commission for the NIC. We started, I think, in 2015. Yeah, we did about a year and a half. And we looked at a lot of research. And one of the things that has changed my thinking, and when I talk about hazing now, I talk about it very differently. Because I think the mistake that all of us are making is we talk about hazing exclusively as a college problem, and more specifically a fraternity problem. But one of the studies out of the University of Maine indicates that 47% of high school students have experienced hazing before they get to college. So we're waiting way too late. My campus has anti-hazing workshops. Everybody does them. I speak at a lot of them myself, so I know. I spoke at Louisiana Tech and did one for them a couple of months ago. So we all do this. It's too late. These conversations should be like bullying. We should talk about hazing in middle school and high school. And all you have to do is do a news search, and you'll see the numbers of high school hazing cases that are happening, mostly related to athletics, but they might be ROTC related or some kind of social club related as well. So it's really a huge problem that we're waiting too late, and we just keep thinking of it as it's a fraternity problem. No, it's bigger than that, and it starts earlier. So if we haven't talked about hazing before they get to college, at least half of college students now are coming in with some kind of predisposition to participate in a hazing activity. So that's something that's changed my thinking over the time. Around that same time in the summer of 2015, I spoke to the executives of the national fraternities, and I challenged them to think very differently about the work that they do. Part of it is we have to understand today's students better. There's a lot of research about today's students that we don't discuss enough, and I challenge that group to do some of those kinds of things. And we've got to start to ask our groups hard questions. Who comes into the organization? Do they believe in the beliefs that the organization espouses? All these organizations have these lofty mottos and ideas and aims. And the question we have to ask, are students joining for that, or are they joining for the Animal House image? And that's something that we're going to have to deal with as a part of that. And then in the last year or so, and there's a book by this title, there's an article that came out in the Federalist called The Death of Expertise. And I love this article, and it relates back to my experience with some of the students at the University of Georgia, because students are deciding that this is what they want to do. This is the experience. It doesn't matter if you have an expert come in about the dangers of hazing, you have the campus staff people, you have the university president. They have decided that they are the experts, and so it doesn't matter what they say. In this article, the author says, I fear we are witnessing the death of expertise, a Google-fueled, Wikipedia-based, blog-siding collapse of any division between professionals and laymen, students and teachers, knowers and wonderers. In other words, between those of any achievement in an area and those with none at all. And so that's the challenge that we find ourselves in addressing this problem. As I said last week, I was with about 70, 75 seasoned fraternity sorority professionals, and I asked them some hard questions about what's working, what's not working, how do we challenge this, because as I said in the beginning, I think this has probably been the worst year we've had, at least in the last 20 years. And I'll have to go back and look at the research by Hank Newer to see if we've had 5 deaths in any year. And he's been tracking these statistics back to the early 1900s. So we're in a really critical situation. And the honest answer for everyone is we don't know what to do. You're seeing lots of campuses say, well, we're going to shut down, as we saw here at LSU. Let's shut down all the groups for a while. And then we'll bring everyone back, and then people still violate the rules. Once again, it's like they're the experts. So it's like, okay, you stopped us for a while, but this is what we want to do, and we're going to do this anyway. And so that becomes a challenge. How do you deal with this? Some people will say, well, just get rid of the groups. Let's not have fraternities and sororities. As I just indicated, the death last week is an unrecognized group. There's a documentary on Netflix called Frat Boys, and it's about a former Lambda Chi Alpha chapter at the University of Central Florida. Remember I told you Lambda Chi Alpha got rid of pledging in 1974. A chapter that has been suspended. They've created their own fraternity that they call the Gazzoni family. And so our documentary on Netflix talks about the Gazzoni family. And you can see the evidences of the drinking, the hazing, and they bill it as frat with no rules. And they are able to recruit because people want that. They're like, we don't have to worry about what IFC says or what UCF says. We do what we want to do because we're not recognized, and this is a good thing. And so when people say, well, we'll just not recognize the groups, they're going to exist anyway. And so if I put on my administrator hat, I'd rather have a partner with a national organization to try to manage than to have a group that's out there on their own, and I'm on my own trying to handle this group. So we're at a point where people really have no idea what to do, even though we're seeing more and more deaths. And so this becomes one of the greatest problems in higher education. And as I tell people, it's not simple. You're talking about changing a culture that's 600 years old. And that makes it the challenge. It's not just a policy that you can add. This is a 600-year-old problem that we haven't figured out, and now it seems like it's getting worse. I'm not sure or not, but this year has probably been the worst. So that's some food for thought, and I'll entertain any questions that you might have. Yeah.
So, the last note you were making about how this is just kind of going to happen anyway, happening unrecognized. Is there not an argument from the administration, the campus administration perspective, to just sort of cut ties with the organizations to protect their own liability?
Right. Well, so there have been cases when people have tried to do that. When there are suits like that, people are going to sue the institution anyway, because then if you have an unrecognized group, you have to ensure that you are doing everything above and beyond to prevent yourself from being sued. Let's see. I was at Albany State 2000, 2004. So somewhere around that time, around 2000, Iona College in New York was sued because they had an unrecognized group that had a hazing case. And I can't remember how it was disposed, but at that same time at Albany State, we had a group that was trying to operate the same way. And so what I learned from that case is that we had to basically go to war against the unrecognized group, meaning we sent out campus notices to tell everyone this group is not recognized, there are no members of this group. We had to name students and say these people are not members of this group. We had to talk about it in orientation. We sent out letters to parents. So a lot of people are doing those kinds of things, but in the end, so it might lessen some of your liability, but the case is still going to be made. Institution, you didn't do enough. You have this unrecognized group. I mean, you're going to be sued one way or another. Even on most of these cases, and even with the death cases and cases I've worked on, people normally don't sue the institution. They go after the group that's involved because the institution can say, we have the staff in place, we do the training. So normally institutions aren't that big, but with an off-campus group, sometimes I think people say, you've abdicated your responsibility, institution, and so we want to tie you into that. And then is that best for your students to have? You have students that are interacting with off-campus groups. I don't think the group at UCF has had any major incidents where police have been involved, but that's going to be the test case because everybody knows. I mean, there's a Netflix documentary now, so everybody knows this group exists, and everybody knows UCF has nothing to do with it, and they bill themselves as completely off campus. But thankfully, nothing bad has happened, but if it does, that's going to be the test case.
And then on that, can you follow, just as a follow, can you talk a little bit more about the liability, when groups have sued the institutions for the
Right. So normally what happens is institutions usually work with the victims of hazing cases. And so I haven't worked a case, I'm trying to think. I don't think I've worked anywhere the institution has been sued. And for me, that would probably be somewhat of a conflict of interest based on my day job. So, but that hasn't been the case. I always tell students when I'm advising them, every case that I have worked, except for one, it's been settled because fraternities know they can't win in court. And the reason I say that is that a fraternity can't come into court and convince a jury of peers that all the things that they say they do, because the die has been cast. When the average person thinks about fraternities and sororities and they hear hazing, they believe that. So they all get settled. The only case I didn't have that got settled is because a young man, I believe, committed suicide 2 weeks before the case. And this was a case in Arkansas. So they settle them. They don't want to take the chance because they really cannot win. The jury's not going to buy that, and because now we just see more and more of these cases, and they see students continue to participate in hazing activities, it's not something that they can win. Yes.
What about the link between alcohol and hazing?
Yeah.
Is it becoming more intense?
Yeah, they're all linked together. And so when I talked about that commission that the NIC had, when you take those three together, alcohol, sexual assault, sexual harassment, hazing, they're all linked together. And there are lots of research studies that will show alcohol a lot of times plays a link to hazing. Some of that is culturally based too. So groups that are predominantly white, usually if there's a hazing death, is alcohol related. I mean, the person died because of alcohol poisoning. For historically black and Latino groups, it's usually physical hazing. And I always tell people, historically, when we had hazing in the United States, with freshmen, it was all physical. So like I said, it was a scalping, it was paddling, it was beating. So that's what you see in the Latino and African American groups. There are Asian fraternities as well who've had hazing cases, and it could be both. They've had both. They've had alcohol-related deaths, and they've had physical deaths, like the one that was in New York at Baruch a couple years ago. It was physical. They were out in the snow and somebody got hit in the head. They were, playing football and doing all kind of things like that. But a lot of times there is a direct link between alcohol use and people engaging in hazing, and then alcohol being used as a tool for the hazing. Here, and then I'll come back.
Now that some of the members, especially in that, I guess, the Penn State case, have been brought to court, and I think sentence has been handed down in a couple of cases, but on appeal, what is the likelihood of those young men actually serving any length of time?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. When they first brought the charges, everything got pushed down because they didn't have sufficient evidence. Well, then now they have new videotape that they were able to recover that one of the young men tried to erase, and so they went back and recharged people. I think because there is a lot of national spotlight on this, I believe you're going to see some people go to jail. I personally, and like I said, with the Florida A&M band case, 3 or 4 people went to jail because of that. The longest is serving 77 months in jail. So there now is a precedent for people to go to jail, even though the Pennsylvania law, but I don't think they're charging with hazing. They're charging with something harsher than that. In Florida, you can charge them for hazing. They can get up to 5 years. Pennsylvania, I think they're charging them differently, whereas involuntary manslaughter or something like that. So I think there's a good chance because the parents have been very active. They've done the major morning shows, NBC Today, all those kinds of things. There's a lot of attention to that one. And I think because you've had these other deaths since that, I think that there's a chance that people will serve time in that. And then the case also up in that region of the Asian fraternity, I think 2 men pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter, and they will do time for that. So there is now more, this didn't happen 10 years ago. So I think you'll see more jail sentences associated with hazing, particularly if there's a death now.
Is that part of the solution, or is the solution getting into the classrooms in high school, or is that still too late to prevent this? And what's the draw? Is it ultimately just wanting to belong?
Right. So I think there are a couple of things. There are going to have to be a range of solutions. I think it has to be, middle and high school, because we're talking about bullying in middle school. I think we got to talk about hazing. To me, they're cousins. They're very close. So I think you talk about that. I think there has to be more of the legal front. And there are some scholars that believe if we have more of the sentencing and people will go to jail, that will curb some of that. I'm not quite convinced yet, because as I said, in Florida, which has one of the toughest hazing laws, as soon as they had people go to jail, I mean, literally, it's announced they're going to jail. Within 6 months, there are at least 2 or 3 hazing cases in the same state. So it's like, I mean, this is you're in Gainesville, this happens in Tallahassee, everybody in the entire state knows, and you still haze. So I think it's the draw of wanting to be part of something, and this is where when I challenge the executive directors of the national fraternities, the research talks about today's college students that they're looking for this sense of place. They don't have the sharpest social skills, a lot of that due to using electronic devices and social media. When I do parents orientation in this book, it's called Generation on a Tightrope, they talk about how there been situations where roommates are having a fight in the room by texting each other. They're in the room together and they're texting each other having an argument. And so when you have those weak kinds of social skills, they're looking for ways to find meaningful connections. So you have this powerful vehicle. For some students, it's being part of something that's larger than themselves. It's a big national brand that they could be part of. So you have all those things together, which makes it a very difficult, because it still is going to be alluring for people. They come to school and they want to do this. They might know there's a legacy in their family of having members of a certain group, and they want to continue that legacy. I don't know. I mean, that's where we're at this point where everybody's shaking their heads like, what do we do with this? Because we're doing the education. We're now starting to see more people go to jail, which I believe. I mean, I really think that the whole judicial part of it, and I know our criminal justice system is overburdened, I think it needs to come away from the campuses. I think everybody should go straight criminal. I don't think there should be hazing charges. Charge everybody with, if it's manslaughter, if it's murder, if it's assault and battery, I think we should just charge them like that and not call it hazing anymore. That might just be part of it, to do it. I don't know if that would change it, but there's some dancing around hazing, and every state doesn't have a hazing law, and most of them are light. So Florida's tough, California's tough, I think Utah, maybe one more. That's it. They're light. Louisiana's light.
What do you think, or how genuine are the interests of the national organizations? I mean, it's been pointed out that the people who are in the leadership roles have come through the same system.
Yeah.
They were based themselves likely. So when they're shutting these organizations down, how genuine are they when they say that they want to eliminate hazing within their own organization?
Well, I mean, I think they do, because they know that it damages the brand of the institution. There's going to be legal liability for the institution, as well as sometimes they might be named. A lot of times that gets worked out. But, anytime I've read a deposition where they're deposing like an executive director, it's a brutal, painful process for them. So I know they don't want to have to do that. So I think genuinely they want to do that. But I honestly think they don't know what to do, because today's students are very different than a previous era. And as I talked about, this era where everybody is an expert, I can even think when I was an undergraduate, there were things that we did that we knew were wrong and were hazing, but if there was someone who told us certain things, we would at least respect that. Sometimes there's now no respect for any authority, because everybody's an expert. They have Google. And so Google is the expert, and they're like, there are ways I can do this without having a problem. So I think they want to, even though they're a product of that system, at some point people realize that it's not a good thing. And I think students will say, well, you did X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, it's a different time. And that's what I tell students. It's like college basketball today is different than when I was a student, where you mean we didn't have, a shot clock when I was an undergraduate, So the rules have changed, and you want to play under the old rules, and that's going to be a problem for you. Yes.
I know this probably goes against the training rules or is there any movement to get the students and people involved to somehow let people know what's going on even anonymously, and so to get their input?
Yeah, well, lots of places have done this. I mean, campuses do a lot of hazing hotlines that are completely anonymous, and a lot of times people do get tips even at the national headquarters. I see it more with sororities and with women, that they're more willing to come forward and have somebody say, hey, this is going on. But you get the pressure the other way too. So I can think about my first job at Emory as a coordinator of Greek life. We would have parents call us and say, hey, there's some hazing going on in X, Y, and Z group, but, I'm just telling you, maybe you tell them to calm down a little bit, because if my son doesn't get in, he's going to be really upset with me. And so they become complicit because they don't really want to tell, the child might say in confidence, Mom, this is happening, and the parent is concerned. They want to tell you a little bit, but they don't want to tell you who they are, who the child is, because they don't want to be the reason that the chapter gets suspended and their child can't join. So they end up working against you. That's part of the challenge. But lots of places set up anonymous ways, and some students will use that as an avenue. I think there is much more awareness about hazing, so I think that we get more reports of hazing, which I think is a good thing. The deaths are the numbers that I can't understand why we're having more of the deaths. That's the part. If we had more reports of hazing, I'm okay with that, because that means more people are telling. But when you get to the death level, they're at a point where people aren't even telling. Like the Penn State case, this guy was at that house in distress for hours and people walked by. It's just, it's like 12 hours, 18 hours, I can't remember the number. It was an insane amount of time where people just walked by him. And it reminds me of the case at MIT in 1997. That boy was passed out on that couch and he suffocated on his vomit and they walked by him.
So is this like a watershed moment given all of these deaths? And you've read a lot of articles about people talking about, is this the end of fraternity culture?
Right.
Realistically, is it?
I don't know. I don't know if this is it. You keep thinking like, okay, is this the new, it's sort of like our national conversation about politics, is this the new low? So it's the same thing. Is this the new low for Greek life? And I don't know. There's been a lot of conversation about this, but people still don't take it seriously. So let me throw the IFC at Louisiana Tech under the bus. I spoke there after we had the death here in Baton Rouge. The group that was not there were IFC members. There were very few that were there. Panhellenic, this year, I spoke at Louisiana Tech in October. Panhellenic is there real strong. Most of these cases do not involve women. They don't have, very rarely do you have a sorority death. They're very rare. That's who's in the audience, full chapter participation. Where you have the issues, the men, they're not there. It's still like, that's not us, that's LSU, that's not us. And so, in light of all of that, not even wanting to hear the conversation about what's going on, to me still signals that there's a problem. So if there's a major hazing case there in the next couple of years, that's going to be used against them. Was your chapter president when the university does this mandatory hazing training? No. If I'm a lawyer working with an expert witness like me, I'm beating everybody over their head with that. They lose that right off the bat, because they weren't even there to get the information. The institution says we've done what we're supposed to do in a reasonable manner, but they can't force them to attend those kind of workshops. So I think naturally there's going to be more pressure. As I try to tell the students at Louisiana Tech, it's going to be interesting because the governor now has shown some interest in what's happening here. I don't know if he's going to follow that up. I know they're doing additional work at LSU to try to figure out, how to address these issues. But I don't know. Is anybody going to say, because all the shutdowns have been temporary. I'm waiting to see if a president's going to say, I'm going to shut down everybody for a year or 2 or 3. And that's when you get outside pressure, because you get the alumni pressure saying, if you do X, Y, and Z, we're holding donations and we're not. And that's real. We saw that at Emory when we closed chapters, that people come out the woodwork and say, why are you closing this chapter? It's like, because they're hazing, they're doing drugs, and they're doing all these other things, and you haven't been around, so now you want to show up. That makes it a challenge. But I don't know yet. We have to see, is there going to be a campus that does something extremely drastic? And for me, it will be a campus that says, I'm just going to shut down Greek life until everybody graduates and we're going to start over. That would be drastic. Now, will it work? I don't know. And honestly, I don't think it would, because new people would come back. There will be recent graduates that will come back and tell people this is what we used to do. There will be people at other schools that would tell them, you guys need to do it like this. And so it's sort of hard because you aren't completely insulated from it. So even if a campus says we're going to get rid of everybody and bring back everybody new and fresh and try to create a new culture on our campus, it's still going to be affected by other campuses and other people. So I don't know what the solution is. But it'll be interesting, particularly places where they had the deaths, to see what happens next. What's the next step? Or do we have this heightened awareness and then we go back to business as usual, which could happen.
And the straight to the
Everything you gather, you can gather information, work with police, but they should be charged by police. You get prosecutors involved, and it goes straight criminal. And there's a Hank Newer who's written several books about hazing. I think in his last book, he advocated for that. And when he first came out with it, I was like, Hank, I don't know about that. I'm with him 100%. Just don't call it hazing anymore. It's like, you committed a crime, you just killed somebody. We're not gonna call it hazing. You committed murder. And just call it what it is.
Have you had any calls to testify in or be an expert on the hazing that goes on in sports teams in college?
I haven't done a sports case yet. Like I said, I've done band cases. So here they settled this case. Before I moved here, when I was in Arkansas, there was a band hazing case at Southern. I was Southern's expert actually for that one, for the things. I actually did a workshop for them. So I've done a couple of band cases, but I haven't done sports yet. So, but as part of the solution, as a part of the task force I led for the NIC, we feel like athletics has to be a part of it. So it can't just be fraternity and sorority community. It's got to be athletics, including professional athletes, because we still do the stories about, the rookies that have to wear something funny. It's benign, but it's still part of a hazing culture. So we have to have athletics involved, professional as well as high school and collegiate athletics. Even though in athletics, we normally don't see it with your high-profile sports. You don't see it as much with football and basketball. You see like crew and wrestling, that's where rugby, those are places where you see more of the hazing that goes on. Yeah.
You were on the LSU task force who's evaluating the Greek life right now. What would you recommend?
That's a good question, and hopefully sometimes I'll have a chance to talk to their task force, participate. I think they're going to have to really take a deep dive to try to understand what is the Greek life culture at LSU. What are the reasonable steps that we can start to make to change the culture? Because we're talking about changing culture. So what all goes into the culture of Greek life there? Let's understand that first. First step is to get everybody to realize there's a problem. This is a campus that's had 2 high-profile deaths in 20 years. That's a problem. One is bad enough, but you've got 2 that, in 20 years that are pretty bad and get a lot of attention. So how do we get people to start thinking very differently about it, but, to understand the culture better? What's driving our culture to have these kind of alcohol-related deaths? So it's going to link all those things together, the alcohol piece, just what's campus alcohol culture, because that feeds into this as well. But that's got to be a part of what piece can we bite off first and say, let's start changing this part of the culture and then move to some other things. I think for all campuses, more awareness, if we're able to get students and parents to talk more openly about hazing and to report it, that helps. But once again, sometimes parents become complicit because they don't want to get the child in trouble and they don't want the child mad that they told what's going on. But I think that has to be part of the conversation as a part of orientation. I think even on our campus, we're doing some more to talk a little bit about hazing with parents in orientation, just as another step to get them to start understanding like, hey, this happens all across the country. We want you to be aware of this. If you see something or you hear something, please let us know. You got to get as many eyes on it as possible.